The monk hadn't spoken in 7 years. Not a word, not a whisper, not even a gasp when he dropped the heavy psalter on his foot. His lips moved only in silent prayer. His brothers communicated with him through hand signals developed over decades. He ate in silence, worked in silence, and when he died without ever breaking his vow. But he wasn't alone. Across medieval Europe, people chose silence or had silence forced upon them. Some were holy, some were mad, some were simply trying to survive a world where the wrong words could kill you. So what happened to people who stopped speaking? How did they communicate? And how did society treat them? Before we uncover the strange world of medieval silence, if you're fascinated by how people survived without one of humanity's most basic tools, hit the subscribe button and give a like. The most common practitioners of deliberate silence were monks and nuns following strict monastic rules. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed hundreds of monasteries across Europe, mandated periods of silence throughout the day and night. From the evening service of Compline until morning prayers, absolute silence reigned. No conversation, no unnecessary noise, nothing that broke the contemplative atmosphere. But some religious orders went further. Carthusian monks lived in near total silence for their entire lives. Each monk occupied a small hermitage within the monastery walls, eating, sleeping, and praying alone. They met for communal worship but didn't speak even then, only singing or chanting liturgy. Personal conversation was forbidden, except on rare occasions, perhaps once a week during a brief recreation period. These monks could go days without speaking a single word to another human being. The silence was intentional, designed to strip away worldly distractions and focus the mind entirely on God. Without conversation, without the noise of social interaction, the monk could hear divine whispers that were drowned out by ordinary life. This was the theory. The reality was often psychological torment. Here's where the physical effects of prolonged silence emerge. Humans aren't built for extended speechlessness. The vocal cords, like any muscle, weaken without use. Monks who maintained strict silence for years found that when they finally did speak, perhaps to confess sins to a priest or give testimony in legal matters, their voices came out rough, weak, barely above a whisper. Some reported forgetting how to modulate volume, speaking too quietly to be heard, or suddenly shouting without meaning to. The mechanics of speech, breathing correctly while forming words, coordinating tongue and lips, became foreign after years of disuse. Beyond the physical, psychological effects were profound. Some monks reported that silence brought peace, a clarity of thought impossible in the noisy world. They described their minds becoming quieter, less cluttered with trivial concerns, more attuned to spiritual matters. But others experienced the opposite. Silence became a prison, where thoughts echoed endlessly with no outlet. Obsessive ideas circled in their heads, growing larger and more distorted without the release valve of conversation. Some monks developed what we'd now recognize as symptoms of sensory deprivation. Hallucinations, both auditory and visual, hearing voices that weren't there, seeing figures in empty corridors. The monastic chronicles occasionally mention brothers who went mad from silence, who had to be released from their vows because they couldn't endure it. Communication in silent monasteries required elaborate systems of hand signals and gestures. These sign languages were sophisticated, with hundreds of specific signs for common objects, actions, and concepts. A monk could ask for bread by making a circular motion, mimicking kneading dough. Wine was indicated by a drinking gesture. Different finger positions signaled various tools or books. Some monasteries compiled sign dictionaries, written guides showing each gesture and its meaning, ensuring that monks transferred between houses could understand and be understood. These systems worked remarkably well for practical matters. Monks could coordinate work, request items, and manage daily routines without speaking. But abstract concepts, emotions, theological discussions were nearly impossible to express through gestures alone. A monk struggling with doubt, experiencing spiritual crisis, or needing pastoral guidance had limited options. He could write, if literate and if writing materials were available, or he could wait until the designated times when speech was permitted. This limitation meant that silent monks often internalized their struggles, dealing with profound questions and pains entirely alone, and the isolation intensified whatever they were experiencing. Now the darker purpose of silence reveals itself. Outside monasteries, silence was sometimes imposed rather than chosen, and it carried very different meanings. In medieval courts, accused criminals who refused to speak faced a brutal procedure called pressing or peine forte et dure in French law. The accused was laid on their back, arms and legs spread and tied. A wooden board was placed on their chest, and heavy stones were added one at a time. The weight increased until the person either agreed to speak and enter a plea, or was crushed to death. This torture was designed specifically to break silence, to force words from mouths that refused to open. Why would anyone endure this rather than simply speak? The answer lay in property law. If a person died without being convicted, their property passed to their heirs, but a conviction meant forfeiture, the crown or lord seizing everything. So some accused criminals chose death by pressing, staying silent under literal crushing weight to protect their family's inheritance. They died without speaking, their final act of silence a gift to their children. The records of such cases are brief and horrific. Most people broke, screaming for mercy after a few stones. A few endured until death, and those names were remembered as either martyrs or fools depending on who told the story. Women's silence carried unique and complex meanings in medieval society. The ideal woman was supposed to be quiet, soft-spoken, deferential. Silence is the ornament of women, wrote one medieval moralist, expressing a common view that female speech was inherently problematic. Too much talking made a woman seem immodest, quarrelsome, or shrewish. So many women practiced strategic silence, speaking little in public to maintain respectability. But some women took this to extremes that medieval society found both holy and disturbing. Female mystics, women who claimed direct communication with God, sometimes stopped speaking to earthly beings entirely. They would only whisper prayers or in some cases communicate solely through writing or through intermediary nuns who translated their gestures. Christina of Marciate, a 12th century mystic, lived in a tiny cell for years, speaking to no one, sustained by food passed through a small opening. Her silence was interpreted as deep holiness, evidence that she'd transcended worldly concerns. Other silent women were viewed more suspiciously. A woman who suddenly stopped speaking after trauma, the death of a child, sexual assault, or other horror, was difficult for medieval medicine to understand. Some physicians diagnosed hysteria, a wandering womb that affected the voice. Treatments involved foul-smelling substances held under the nose to drive the womb back into place, or herbal drinks to restore speech. When these failed, religious explanations emerged. Perhaps demons had stolen her voice. Perhaps she was being tested by God. Perhaps she was faking for attention. Don't miss this crucial psychological reality. Some medieval people lost speech not through choice but through conditions we'd now recognize as psychological trauma, selective mutism, or conversion disorder. A soldier who witnessed unspeakable violence in war might return home unable to speak, his voice locked behind the horrors he couldn't process. A child severely abused might retreat into silence as the only safe response. A woman raped might find that words had become impossible, that her throat closed around any attempt to describe what happened. Medieval society had no framework for understanding these conditions. They weren't seen as psychological injuries but as moral or spiritual failures, as demonic influence, or as divine punishment. The silent person was treated with suspicion and often cruelty. They couldn't defend themselves, couldn't explain, couldn't participate in the social world that required speech. Many ended up as beggars, unable to work in trades that required verbal communication, unable to negotiate or advocate for themselves. Others were taken in by monasteries as servants, given simple manual labor that didn't require talking. A few were accused of witchcraft, their silence interpreted as refusal to confess demonic pacts, and they faced torture that they couldn't speak through even if they wanted to because their voices were gone. The experience of going silent after years of normal speech was documented in a few remarkable cases. One chronicle describes a merchant who took a vow of silence after his entire family died in a plague outbreak. He continued his business, buying and selling through written notes and gestures, surprisingly successfully. Customers grew accustomed to his silence. He carried a wax tablet and stylus, writing what he wanted to say and erasing it after being read. This worked for transactions but made personal relationships impossible. His friends drifted away because conversation couldn't flow with written exchanges. He became increasingly isolated, defined entirely by his silence, and when he died decades later, having never spoken again, his will revealed he'd forgotten why he took the vow. The grief that drove him to silence had faded, but the habit had become his identity. Breaking it would have meant confronting decades of accumulated loss and change, so he stayed silent until death. This pattern appeared repeatedly. Silence that began as response to acute trauma became permanent because returning to speech meant processing everything that happened during the silent years, and that was more terrifying than continuing in silence. Here's the surprising community that formed around silence. In some medieval cities, groups of mute people, some born without speech, others who'd lost it, formed informal networks. They developed their own sign systems, more complex than monastic signs because they needed to communicate about worldly matters, prices, gossip, relationships. They gathered in certain taverns or workshops where proprietors learnt to understand them. They married each other, creating households where gesture replaced speech entirely. Children born into these households grew up bilingual, fluent in both sign and spoken language, serving as interpreters between their parents and the speaking world. These communities were small and left few records because they operated outside official channels, but occasional legal documents mention them, usually when property disputes arose, and interpreters had to be brought in to translate the silent parties' testimonies. The existence of these networks shows that medieval society, despite its limitations, found ways to accommodate people who couldn't speak, though always on the margins, always as exceptions rather than full participants. Religious authorities struggled with theological questions raised by silence. Could someone who couldn't speak receive communion? Most priests said yes. If the person showed reverence through gesture, could a mute person confess sins? This was more problematic. Confession required verbal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but some priests accepted written confessions or allowed mute penitents to nod in response to specific questions about sins. Could mute people be ordained as priests? Generally no, because conducting Mass required speaking the consecration prayers aloud. But some mute men became monks, living out their lives in orders where their silence was seen as particularly holy, precisely because it was permanent and involuntary. They were God's special servants, already living the ideal of silence that others struggled to achieve. Whether the mute monks themselves saw it as blessing or curse wasn't recorded. Their voices, or lack thereof, weren't deemed important enough to preserve. The breaking of silence, when it happened, was often dramatic and interpreted as miraculous. Chronicles record cases of mute people suddenly speaking after touching holy relics, drinking blessed water, or experiencing visions. A woman who hadn't spoken in 10 years attended a saint's shrine and began singing hymns during the service, her voice clear and strong. A child born mute reportedly spoke his first words at age 7 while praying at his mother's grave. These stories served religious purposes, proving the power of faith and the reality of miracles. But they also suggest that some silence was psychosomatic, that whatever blocked speech could be unblocked by intense emotional or spiritual experiences. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern. Selective mutism and conversion disorders can resolve suddenly when the underlying trauma is processed, or when the person feels safe enough to speak. Medieval people attributed this to divine intervention, but the mechanism was the same: silence that served a protective purpose, ending when protection was no longer needed, or when a shock was powerful enough to override the block. By the late medieval period, attitudes toward voluntary silence began shifting. Extreme asceticism, which included permanent silence, fell somewhat out of favor among church authorities. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 required annual confession, which implied speech. New preaching orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans emphasized verbal communication of faith rather than silent withdrawal. The cultural tide was turning toward engagement with the world rather than rejection of it. Silent monks were still respected, but new vocations increasingly involved speaking, teaching, preaching, debating. For non-religious silent people, conditions improved slightly as medicine began separating physical muteness from moral judgment. Physicians studied anatomy, understanding that the tongue, throat, and lungs were mechanical systems that could be damaged without divine punishment being involved. This didn't help much practically. Treatments remained ineffective, but it reduced the stigma somewhat. Silent people were seen as unfortunate rather than cursed, disabled rather than possessed. The legacy of medieval silence is visible in modern attitudes towards speech and communication. We still valorize silence in certain contexts: meditation retreats, moments of remembrance, the strong silent type in popular culture. We also still stigmatize involuntary silence, treating people with speech disorders or selective mutism as less capable or less intelligent. The medieval tension between holy silence and suspicious silence persists, and the networks of mute people who developed sign language in medieval cities were precursors to modern deaf communities and sign languages, showing that humans will always find ways to communicate even when denied speech. The monks who died having spoken barely a word in decades, the trauma survivors who lost their voices, the accused criminals who chose crushing death over speaking, all of them navigated a world that demanded words but sometimes made silence the only rational choice. Their experiences remind us that speech is both gift and burden, that silence can be chosen or imposed, and that communication goes far deeper than the sounds we make.